We'll continue working with the Burton and King article, Hurst, Bernick, and Daniel article, and the O'Hare and Scher article for examples. One of the reasons I included this section of the worksheet is to help us remember that the design will influence the knowledge we can take away from the study. If it isn't an experiment, we can't think about it in terms of cause and effect. Authors aren't always as precise as could be and do sometimes make statements that would seem like they did an experiment. But when we look at the variables, we realize they didn't manipulate anything or even measure a naturally occurring group for a quasi-experimental design. That said, remember an experiment technically has two defining characteristics. At least one variable is manipulated or controlled, and random assignment. In other words, each participant has an equal likelihood of being in any of the levels of the independent variable. The process of identifying the variables for Burton and King helped us find all the information we need to know that this was an experimental study. In some cases, the authors won't include information about how participants were assigned to the levels. If they manipulate a variable as part of the operational definition, we tend to still call it an experiment in the absence of another category. Note, too, the authors didn't use words cause and effect in the hypothesis. That goes along with the ideas I've mentioned about not using the word prove and thinking about generalizability. The language they use allows for the possibility that other variables were involved. This section of the worksheet will be pretty brief. When we looked at the variables in the Hurst article, we noted the article format was a little different, and the way the variables were operationalized was a little different. After looking at the variables, we know they didn't manipulate a variable, so that's all we need to know it's a non-experimental study. The key word in the purpose statements were review and synthesize. In this case, it can be helpful to note that the specific type of non-experimental study can help jog our memory later when we're compiling information from our notes. This is an example of a content analysis. Our text talks about content analysis in the chapter about descriptive research, but emphasizes the analysis of popular media. In some cases, though, researchers also analyze other articles. Now pause the recording to look at the O'Hare and Scher article. All the variables in O'Hare and Scher were measured, so it's not an experiment. Hopefully you would question the ethics of manipulating substance use, and we can't manipulate gender, though it is sometimes treated as the independent variable in quasi-experimental designs. The symptoms of stress would be hard to manipulate, though we'll read studies that manipulate levels of stress to measure the symptoms. Given that this is more typical of non-experimental designs than the Hurst article, just putting non-experimental in our notes is sufficient. Hopefully, knowing about APA style and working through the other sections of the worksheet combines with your knowledge about the types of designs to make the process of identifying the design pretty straightforward. As I mentioned in talking about Burton and King, we do sometimes come across articles that manipulate a variable and don't mention how participants were assigned to groups. We typically consider that an experiment, but things like that are part of the reason we use words like suggest and indicate. They add to the possibility other variables were involved.